The Sahara Desert covers 3.6 million square miles. That's roughly the size of China. And every single grain of sand, every dune, every endless golden expanse, according to geologists, formed over millions of years through natural weathering processes. Wind, water, time. That's the story. That's what you learnt in school. That's what every documentary has told you since childhood. But what if I told you that the Sahara isn't ancient at all? What if those billions upon billions of tons of sand didn't form naturally over eons, but appeared suddenly, catastrophically, in a single event? What if the Sahara Desert is actually sawdust, not a metaphor, actual sawdust, the debris field left behind when something unimaginably massive was cut down and processed? What if the Sahara is the stump of a tree so large it defies comprehension? If you want to understand how global economics, resource extraction, and historical narratives connect to reshape what we think we know about our planet, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed economic history and alternative timelines every week. Now let's talk about what they don't want you questioning. The official story starts with silica. Sand, we're told, is primarily composed of silicon dioxide. Quartz, it forms when rocks break down through weathering. Rain dissolves minerals. Wind grinds surfaces. Glaciers pulverize stone. Over millions of years, mountains become beaches. Continents become deserts. The process is slow, gradual, and utterly mundane. Nothing to question. Nothing to investigate. Except the Sahara doesn't behave like other deserts. The grain size is too uniform. The distribution is too even. The chemical composition is too consistent across millions of square miles. For a desert supposedly formed by random natural processes over incomprehensible timescales, the Sahara is suspiciously organized. It's almost as if someone spread it there deliberately, or more accurately, as if it all came from the same source at the same time. Then there's the depth. In some regions, Saharan sand reaches depths of over 150 feet. That's not a thin layer of weathered rock. That's a debris field. That's a dumping ground. And when you start asking where all that material actually came from, the mainstream explanations start to crack. Geologists will tell you the sand came from ancient riverbeds, from the Atlas Mountains, from erosion of the Saharan bedrock itself. But here's the problem. The volume doesn't match. The Atlas Mountains, even accounting for millions of years of erosion, could not produce the sheer tonnage of sand currently sitting in the Sahara. The math doesn't work. The sediment budget, as geologists call it, is wildly unbalanced. There's more sand than there should be. A lot more. So where did it come from? Now let's talk about trees. Not the trees you see in your backyard, not even the giant sequoias of California, though those are impressive in their own right. Let's talk about the kind of trees that existed before recorded history, the kind that don't fit into our current understanding of biology, botany, or planetary ecology. The kind that, if they existed, would rewrite everything we think we know about Earth's past. In 1936, a group of miners in Washington state stumbled across a petrified stump. They measured it, 15 feet in diameter. Impressive, but not unheard of. Then they kept digging. The stump kept going, 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet in diameter. They stopped measuring, they stopped digging. They covered it back up. No official report was ever filed, no photographs were ever released. But the story survived, passed down through mining communities, whispered about in geological surveys that never made it to publication. If a tree stump 50 feet in diameter existed, and that's just the base, how tall was the tree? How wide was the canopy? And more importantly, how much sawdust would you get if you cut it down? Here's where the Sahara starts to make sense. A tree 40 miles wide at the base. Yes, 40 miles. Not 40 feet, 40 miles. A tree so massive that its trunk could be seen from orbit. A tree whose roots stretched hundreds of miles underground, tapping into aquifers we now call fossil water. A tree whose canopy covered an area the size of a small country. A tree that, when cut down and processed, would produce a debris field roughly the size of the Sahara Desert. This isn't speculation pulled from thin air. This is pattern recognition. This is connecting dots that have been deliberately scattered across disciplines to prevent anyone from seeing the full picture. Geologists study sand but don't ask about trees. Botanists study trees but don't ask about deserts. Historians study civilizations but don't ask about the resources that fueled them. And economists, the ones who should be asking the biggest questions of all, have been trained to look forward, never backward. Let's talk about wood as a resource. In the modern world, we think of wood as a renewable building material. Plant a tree, wait 50 years, harvest it, repeat. Sustainable, manageable. But what if, in the distant past, wood wasn't renewable at all? What if the trees that existed were so old, so massive, so integral to the planetary ecosystem that cutting even one of them down would be an act of ecological catastrophe? And what if someone did it anyway? The economic implications are staggering. A single tree 40 miles in diameter would contain more usable timber than every forest on Earth combined today. The amount of lumber, the amount of cellulose, the amount of raw material you could extract from one tree would be enough to build entire civilizations, cities, fleets, infrastructure on a scale we can barely imagine. You wouldn't need to plant forests. You wouldn't need to manage resources carefully. You'd have effectively infinite material for centuries, maybe millennia. But when it ran out, you'd be left with nothing but sawdust, billions of tons of it, and you'd need somewhere to put it. Now let's look at the timeline. Mainstream history tells us the Sahara has been a desert for at least 5,000 years. Some estimates go back further. But there's a problem with that narrative. Rock art found in the Sahara depicts lush vegetation, rivers, and wildlife. Hippos, crocodiles, elephants. These paintings aren't ancient mythology. They're documentation. People lived in the Sahara when it was green. They fished in its rivers. They hunted in its forests. They built settlements along waterways that no longer exist. And then, suddenly, it all disappeared. The water vanished, the vegetation died, the animals fled or starved, and the sand appeared, not gradually, not over millions of years, quickly, catastrophically, within a single human lifetime, or maybe even faster. The Sahara didn't slowly become a desert, it was turned into one. So what happened? What could cause such a rapid transformation? The mainstream explanation is climate change. Shifts in the Earth's axis, changes in ocean currents, variability in solar radiation, all plausible, all scientifically sound, all completely inadequate to explain the sheer speed and totality of the transformation. But if the Sahara isn't a natural desert, if it's a dumping ground, then the timeline makes perfect sense. You cut down the tree, you process the wood, you use the lumber to build your civilization. And you're left with a waste product, sawdust, mountains of it. You need to get rid of it, and the easiest way is to spread it across the area where the tree used to stand. You level the landscape, you bury the evidence, you create a desert where a forest once stood, and then you move on. Let's talk about what cutting down a tree that size would actually involve. We're not talking about axes and saws. We're not talking about manual labor. We're talking about industrial scale resource extraction, machinery, engineering, coordinated effort on a level that would require knowledge of physics, metallurgy, and logistics, far beyond what we attribute to ancient civilizations. Or maybe not ancient at all, maybe recent, maybe within the last 1,000 years, not the last 10,000. There's a theory in alternative history circles that the timeline we've been taught is wrong, not off by a few decades, off by centuries, maybe more, that there was a global civilization, technologically advanced, resource-hungry, that existed far more recently than we're told. A civilization that had the capability to harvest resources on a planetary scale. A civilization that cut down the great trees, drained the aquifers, reshaped the landscape, and then vanished. Or more accurately, collapsed under the weight of its own extraction economy. And the evidence was buried, literally, under sand, under narrative, under layers of revised history designed to make us think the world has always been the way it is now, that deserts are natural, that resources are scarce, that our current civilization is the first and only one to achieve this level of technological sophistication. But the Sahara doesn't support that story. The Sahara, when you look at it with fresh eyes, looks like a crime scene, a planetary scale, clear cut. And the sawdust is still there, billions of tons of it, covering the evidence. Now let's examine the grain itself. When you look at Saharan sand under a microscope, something strange emerges. The grains are almost perfectly uniform in size, too uniform. Natural weathering produces a range of grain sizes. Large chunks, medium pieces, fine dust. It's random, it's chaotic, it's messy, but Saharan sand is remarkably consistent. And consistency in nature is rare. Consistency suggests processing. Consistency suggests industrial output. Wood, when cut and processed, produces sawdust of relatively uniform size depending on the type of saw used. Different blades produce different grain sizes, but within a single operation, the output is consistent. And if you were processing wood on an industrial scale, using the same equipment across the entire operation, you'd get a debris field of remarkably uniform composition, just like the Sahara. Then there's the question of petrification. We know wood can turn to stone given enough time and the right conditions. We have petrified forests all over the world. Logs that have been buried, mineralized, transformed into rock over millions of years. But what if the process can happen faster? What if, under certain conditions, organic material can petrify in decades or centuries rather than eons? And what if the reason we're told it takes millions of years is because accepting a faster timeline would force us to reconsider everything we think we know about geology, history, and the age of surface features we've been calling ancient? There are formations in the Sahara that look like petrified wood. Massive stone structures with grain patterns, rings, growth lines, textures that match biological material, not geological processes. Mainstream science classifies them as sedimentary rock, unusual formations, natural oddities. But when you compare them to actual petrified wood, the similarities are undeniable. These aren't rocks that happen to look like wood. These are wood that turn to rock. And if the Sahara is full of petrified wood, if the sand itself is fossilized sawdust, then the desert isn't millions of years old. It's hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe less. And that's a problem for the official timeline. A big problem. Let's talk about the economic angle. In any resource extraction economy, there are winners and losers. The ones who control the resources control the wealth. The ones who control the narrative control history. And if there was a civilization that extracted resources on a planetary scale, that built cities and empires and fleets from the lumber of impossibly massive trees, then the wealth generated would be beyond comprehension. Entire dynasties would rise. Entire populations would be enslaved to feed the machine. And when the resources ran out, when the last tree was cut, when the sawdust was spread and the evidence buried, the collapse would be total. But wealth doesn't disappear. It transfers. And the families who controlled the extraction, who profited from the logging operation, who managed the industrial processing of a 40-mile tree, those families would still be around today, rebranded, renamed, hiding in plain sight, still controlling resources, still shaping narratives, still making sure no one asks the right questions about where the sand came from. Now here's where it gets darker. If the Sahara is sawdust, if it's the debris field from a clear-cut operation, then the same process could have happened elsewhere. The Gobi Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Australian outback. Every major desert on Earth could be a dumping ground. Every arid wasteland could be a former forest. Every place we've been told is naturally barren could be the result of deliberate, systematic resource extraction on a scale we've been conditioned not to imagine. And if that's true, if the deserts are evidence of a global logging operation, then the collapse of that civilization wasn't a mystery. It was inevitable. You can't extract finite resources infinitely. You can't cut down planetary scale trees and expect the ecosystem to recover. You can't turn forests into deserts and maintain a stable climate. The civilization that did this, that prioritized extraction over sustainability, that valued profit over ecology, destroyed itself. and we're living in the aftermath. But here's the question no one wants to ask. What if we're doing it again? What if our current industrial model, our current resource extraction economy, our current disregard for long-term ecological consequences is just a repeat of the same pattern? What if the lesson of the Sahara, the lesson buried under billions of tons of sawdust, is that this always ends the same way? Extraction, exploitation, collapse. And then someone rewrites the history to make it look natural. The Sahara isn't a natural desert, it's a warning. And we're ignoring it. Let's go back to the science for a moment. Because despite everything I've just laid out, mainstream geology will tell you this is impossible. Trees can't grow 40 miles wide. The biology doesn't support it. The physics doesn't allow it. Gravity would crush the trunk. The root system couldn't support the weight. The nutrient transport mechanisms wouldn't scale. It's absurd. It's fantasy. It's pseudoscience. But here's the thing about mainstream science. It's based on what we observe now. It's based on the assumption that the rules we see operating today have always operated the same way. That gravity has always been the same. That atmospheric composition has always been the same. That planetary conditions have been stable for millions of years. But what if they haven't? What if Earth's gravity was different in the past? What if atmospheric pressure was higher, allowing for larger organisms? What if the conditions that make 40-mile trees impossible now were completely normal 1,000 years ago? We know the atmosphere has changed. We know oxygen levels have fluctuated. We know magnetic fields shift. We know planetary conditions are not static. So why do we assume biological limits are? During the Carboniferous period, oxygen levels reached 35%. Insects grew to the size of birds. Millipedes stretched 3 feet long. Dragonflies had wingspans of over 2 feet. The biological response to environmental conditions was immediate and dramatic. Higher oxygen, larger organisms, it's not speculation, it's documented fact. And if oxygen levels could support insects the size of ravens 300 million years ago, what could they support 1,000 years ago if conditions were right? But there's another factor. Atmospheric pressure. On Earth today, at sea level, atmospheric pressure is roughly 14.7 pounds per square inch. But pressure varies with altitude, with weather systems, with planetary conditions we barely understand. And if atmospheric pressure was higher in the past, if the weight of the air itself was greater, it would counteract gravitational stress on large organisms. Trees could grow taller, trunks could grow wider. The structural limitations we see today would be irrelevant. And we have evidence this happened. Not theoretical models, actual physical evidence. Petrified stumps found in remote locations that are far larger than any living tree species. The authorities classify them as rock formations, geological oddities, erosion patterns that happen to look like tree rings. But the patterns are too consistent, the structures are too regular. These aren't rocks that look like trees. These are trees that became rocks. Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Officially, it's a volcanic plug. Magma that solidified inside a volcano and was exposed when the surrounding rock eroded away. That's the story. That's what the Park Service tells visitors. But if you look at the columnar basalt, if you study the hexagonal formations, if you compare them to the internal structure of petrified wood, the similarities are impossible to ignore. The columns look like wood grain. The vertical striations match growth patterns. The base flares outward like a root system. And the local indigenous tribes never called it a volcanic plug. They called it a tree stump. Bear Lodge, the place where the bear climbed the tree and left claw marks down the sides. Not a metaphor, a description, because that's what it was. A tree so massive that when it was cut down, the stump alone became a geological landmark. There's a reason mainstream geology dismisses these comparisons, because if Devil's Tower is a petrified tree stump, if formations like it exist all over the world, then the timeline collapses. The millions of years narrative falls apart. And we're forced to confront the possibility that planetary scale trees existed recently enough that humans witnessed them, cut them down, processed them, and buried the evidence under narratives about volcanoes and erosion. Now, let's talk about the infrastructure required to process a tree 40 miles in diameter. This isn't a weekend logging project. This isn't even a modern industrial operation scaled up. This is engineering on a level we can barely conceptualize. You'd need cutting tools capable of slicing through wood on a continental scale. You'd need transportation systems to move lumber measured in cubic miles. You'd need processing facilities the size of cities. And you'd need the energy to power all of it. Where does that energy come from? Fossil fuels? Not if the timeline is what I'm suggesting. Coal and oil, we're told, take millions of years to form. But what if they don't? What if coal is just compressed plant matter and oil is just liquefied organic material, and both can form in centuries rather than eons under the right pressure and heat conditions? What if the coalfields we're mining today are the remnants of the forests that once surrounded the great trees? What if the oil we're extracting is the byproduct of processing operations that liquefied organic waste? The energy was there, the infrastructure existed, and when the operation was complete, when the last tree was felled and the last board was cut and the sawdust was spread across the landscape, the infrastructure was dismantled, or more likely it collapsed along with the civilization that built it. Because that's what happens when you base an entire economy on extracting a finite resource. Eventually, you run out. And when you do, everything built on that foundation crumbles. But the families who profited don't crumble. They adapt, they rebrand, they move their operations to new resources, they rewrite the history to erase their role in the collapse, and they do it again. Timber becomes coal, becomes oil, becomes rare earth metals. The resource changes. The extraction model doesn't, and the families at the top remain the same, just under different names. There's a reason the wealthiest families in the world today have histories stretching back centuries. Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Morgans. These aren't new money families. These are dynasties, and dynasties don't build wealth in a few generations. They build it over centuries, by controlling resources, by shaping markets, by ensuring that no matter what happens to the world around them, they remain on top. And if you trace their wealth back far enough, if you dig past the sanitized histories and the public relations narratives, you start finding connections to industries that shouldn't exist. In the timelines we're given, timber operations in regions that were supposedly uninhabited, mining ventures in locations that were supposedly undiscovered, trade routes that were supposedly impossible. The official history says these things didn't happen, but the financial records say they did. Follow the money. It always tells the truth. And the money says there was a global resource extraction economy operating far more recently than we're told. An economy built on harvesting planetary scale trees. An economy that collapsed when the resources ran out. And an economy whose remnants are still shaping our world today. There's a reason the giant sequoias of California exist. They're remnants, echoes of a time when trees grew larger. And they're still here because they were protected, hidden, too remote to be worth the effort of extraction. But most weren't. Most were cut down, processed, and turned into the resources that built the civilization we refuse to acknowledge. And the sawdust was spread across the continents we now call deserts. Here's the final piece, the one that ties it all together. If you look at historical records, if you dig into the archives that haven't been sanitized, you find references, oblique, coded, descriptions of trees that don't make sense in our current framework. The Yggdrasil of Norse mythology, the tree of life in various religious texts, the world tree, the cosmic tree, the axis mundi. Every ancient culture has a story about a tree so large it connected earth and sky. And we've been told these are metaphors, symbols, mythological constructs representing abstract concepts. But what if they're not? What if they're memories? Oral histories passed down through generations, distorted over time but rooted in actual events. What if every culture has a story about the great tree because every culture witnessed its destruction? And the trauma of that event, the ecological and economic collapse that followed, was so profound that it became embedded in our collective mythology. Look at the details. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil has roots that reach into 3 different realms, 3 different worlds connected by one tree. Now translate that into geological terms: 3 different aquifer systems, 3 different underground water networks, all connected by a root structure so massive it spanned continents. That's not mythology, that's hydrology. And when the tree was cut down, when the roots were severed, the aquifers collapsed, the water tables dropped, and regions that were once lush and fertile became arid wastelands. The Sahara wasn't always dry. We know this. Rock art confirms it. Archaeological evidence confirms it. But the transition from fertile to barren happened faster than natural climate change can explain, unless something catastrophic happened. Unless the primary water source, the root system of a tree that spanned the region, was suddenly removed. Then the timeline makes sense. Then the speed of desertification makes sense. And then the Sahara stops being a mystery and starts being evidence. The Sahara is the stump, the sand is the sawdust, and the story has been buried under both. So where does that leave us? If this is true, if the Sahara is evidence of a planetary scale logging operation, if the deserts are dumping grounds and the timeline is wrong and the civilization that did this collapsed under the weight of its own extraction economy, then what? What do we do with that information? First, we stop accepting narratives without question. We stop assuming that because something is taught in schools, published in textbooks, and repeated by experts, it must be true. We start asking who benefits from the official story, who profits from us believing the Sahara is a natural desert, who gains when we accept resource scarcity as inevitable rather than manufactured. The answers lead to families, corporations, and institutions that have controlled resource extraction for centuries, and they're still in control today. Second, we look at the patterns. We recognize that extraction economies always collapse. Always. Whether it's cutting down 40-mile trees or fracking for oil or strip mining for rare earth metals, the model is the same. Extract until nothing's left. Profit in the short term. Externalize the costs. And when the collapse comes, rebrand, rename, and do it again somewhere else. The names change, the resources change, but the underlying logic remains identical across centuries. Third, we remember. We stop letting history be revised to suit economic interests. We preserve the stories, the anomalies, the evidence that doesn't fit the approved narrative. Because the lesson of the Sahara, the lesson buried under sawdust, is that this has happened before, and if we don't learn from it, it will happen again. The cycle repeats until we break it. The Sahara Desert is 3.6 million square miles of evidence. It's a crime scene. And the crime is still ongoing. Because the same economic model, the same extraction logic, the same disregard for long-term consequences that turned a forest into a wasteland is still running the world today. We just call it progress now. We celebrate quarterly earnings while forests burn. We measure GDP while ecosystems collapse. The metrics change, the language was sanitized, but the pattern remains identical. The Sahara isn't ancient, it's recent, and it's a warning we're refusing to read. But now you know. Now you've seen the pattern, and you can't unsee it. The sand isn't natural, the deserts aren't inevitable, and the history you were taught is a cover story designed to keep you from asking the most important question of all. What else have they buried, and what are they cutting down right now while we're looking the other way? If you want to go deeper into suppressed economic history and the patterns that repeat across civilizations, I've got a video breaking down the 1859 Carrington event as a planetary energy grid failure. Click it now, and if you made it all this far, subscribe, because the more of us who start questioning the official narratives, the harder it becomes to keep the truth buried under sawdust.